that we're turning it over to you. You can hear, right?
Yeah, I had the same problem I had with the other workshop. Well, I could listen to you, but you guys couldn't hear me or see me.
Something
Well,
about coming in as a participant. So we'll have to fix that and make sure you've got the right link on your calendar.
thank you, thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and without further ado, I'll just turn it over to Scott. This is a update on our work in sexual assault. So I'll turn it over to Scott. Take it. Go ahead, Scott.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, commissioners, and just a quick note for Kay. Kathy Hedin is also trying to get in, so if you could help troubleshoot her coming in, because she's right after me. So
she's in.
She is in. Excellent, great, thank you, Mr. Chair, commissioners. We're very pleased to be here today to give you an update on the sexual assault response collaboration. This is a joint presentation by the Safety and Justice Service Team and the Health and Wellness Service Team. I believe it was in August or September at a board meeting, we were asked to come to you with an update on the response collaboration. We said we would do that, but it was going to take about 6 months before we had collected enough data to really be able to do a robust report out. And here we are about 6 months later, and we're pleased to be able to share with you in this presentation some really interesting data that we've collected as part of this initiative. We have a lot of presenters today in a big panel, which is a testament to the complexity and the importance of this work. And so I will hand it off to Mr. Chair. I'll hand it off to my colleague, Kathy Hedin, for a few opening words before we get into the presentation.
Absolutely, and I won't say much because we've got a lot on deck today, but I also just want to echo the gratitude here for the partnership, County Attorney Choi and all of those working within the County Attorney's Office and our community partners as well. I'm here with the hat of Deputy County Manager of Health and Wellness, as well as the Public Health Director supporting Pahua Vang, our SOS supervisor right now, and her team who have been fantastic partners with everyone else here on the screen. So appreciate this opportunity to partner here and move forward, and looking forward to a really important presentation to you all, the board. Thank you.
And so, Mr. Chair, I believe now we will pivot to County Attorney John Choi.
Thank you, Scott. And we do have a very big group of people assembled here to help provide this information to you and the board. I just really want to thank, first of all, you, the board, really for your collaboration as well in supporting this work. Every April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and it's a great opportunity, I think, to talk a little bit about the work that has been going on in Ramsey County for some time, but some of the good outcomes are starting to come to fruition, but we still have a lot of work to do. But today you're going to hear from a lot of really dedicated people from my office, Karen Kugler, Dawn Bax, and then also in the Sheriff's Office, Jessica O'Hearn, and of course from our SOS program, Pahua Vang. We have Chief Erica Scheider from the Roseville Police Department. Chief Axtell will be joining us. Ellen Johnson from our SANE program at Regents Hospital. And also on this panel here are just a lot of dedicated public servants who have been involved in this really collaborative work. So I just want to thank everybody who helped hold this information together, but more importantly, for the work that's really been done over the course of really the past 5 or 6 years. So if I don't have control of the slides, but if somebody could just go to the next slide. So just by way of background, I know that all of you are very aware, but I just think it's a good reminder that this work really began in April of 2016 when we said out loud that Ramsey County would be a Start by Believing community. and that we wanted to collaborate with public health and law enforcement and prosecution to really have started to generate a conversation in our community, because at that time, what we certainly knew was that if you looked at survey data, there are people, many victims, people who would say that they had been a victim of some form of sexual assault, rape, domestic violence, stalking. But we knew that that wasn't necessarily translating into people actually coming forward. And we believe that there were some important conversations that we needed to have within our community about creating a culture and a society that would be more supportive of the victims of sexual assault. And I really want to give a special shout out to Commissioner McDonough, because he really took the initiative when we said that we would be a Start by Believing community. Commissioner McDonough, in his capacity as a Ramsey County Commissioner, went and had conversations with every one of the cities in our jurisdiction. In every city responded by also passing resolutions just like we did to say that we would do that. With the one exception, and I can't remember what city that was, but kudos to Commissioner McDonough for that effort and really starting that conversation. And then, of course, we said at that time that we needed to do a really in-depth review of our response, right? If we wanted to create a better culture so that more victims came forward, we knew at that time that there was a lot of things that we needed to better understand and to improve on just with the little data that we had. And so in 2016, we also commissioned a 2-year study looking at sexual assault incidences in our community and figuring out whether or not those incidents actually get reported to police, and then what police would do with that, and then whether what we did in prosecution, and kind of asking the question too of what can we do to get more advocacy involved with the system response. And so in April of 2018, that study was published, released to the public. And there was a lot of things in there that in terms of gaps that we needed to improve upon. And I'm so glad that we were able to have the leadership of the board, many of the board members here who said that, we need to actually, if we want to make these changes, we need to invest in some of these outcomes. And so I'll highlight some of those outcomes or the investments that we made in the next slide. And then we got to work in 2018. We got together police chiefs. We had some outside facilitation to really start thinking about a plan, of an implementation plan. And then at the same time, we knew that we needed to get more resources, not just from the board, but we needed to get grants to support this work. And then in April of 2019, we were able to finally agree on an actual collaboration plan. If someone can go to the next slide. And this plan involved 9 law enforcement agencies, SOS, the county attorney's office, and we had 44 distinct things that we wanted to accomplish. And we were thinking about really the fundamentals of like how to do this work, how to employ best practices, how to make sure that all of our officers and especially investigators were trained, how to address the deficits and the gaps that were identified in the reports. Like what you might remember is that what we found was that we had 2/3 of incidents that were reported to police were never presented to this office. What we learned was that we had a high dropout rate of victims, and we felt like we could fix that with more advocacy resources. We learned that I think to put it into like an analogy, I think what was happening is that a lot of people in the system, we were all well-intentioned, but I think we were all assuming something that the next person would do. So for instance, the prosecutor would assume that the jury would never convict on this fact pattern or this particular set of circumstances. And then law enforcement, I think oftentimes was thinking, well, the prosecutor will never charge this. And then our victims, our survivors in our community, I think were saying that, I don't know that I can come forward. I don't know that people will believe me. I don't know how this will be received. And so we needed to change all of that. And I think this is really what this work is all about, to recalibrate that and to really thinking about centering our work around victims and survivors and listening to those voices and trying to improve the system response. And so if we could just go to the next slide. And so these are just some of the highlights with regard to the improvement efforts, but I think it's really about the details and the work. And I think there's going to be a lot of people here that will talk to some of those things. And then if we can go to the next slide. And these are the investments that we made as a county. And I think we should be really proud of them, especially you as a board of commissioners and our county managers who are involved in this work. Again, in 2018, when we identified these deficits and we identified our hope and our wish and our North Star to do better around these cases, we immediately provided additional sexual assault advocates for our SOS program. And we did something very extraordinary. We transferred county money over to the St. Paul Police Department so that they would have additional investigative resources for 1 year and a quarter of a year, and that they promised that they would actually make these investments permanent, which they since have. And then, of course, we were also awarded a VAWA grant, and I have some really great news. We have now received word that we are now going to get a second round of grant funding because of the outcomes that we've been able to produce around the first VAWA grant that we received. And then we did something extraordinary by transferring county funds to the Roseville Police Department so that they could have a dedicated investigator. And they have also made the promise, and they have followed through on making this position permanent. So now we have dedicated sexual assault investigators and more in St. Paul. We have now one in Ramsey County Sheriff's Office and in Roseville. And this has great benefits across the board because the work of Roseville and our Sheriff's Office, they've been helping other jurisdictions. And you'll see some of the work that they've been able to do. But I'm really most proud of because none of this really changes if we don't have really good, hardworking, dedicated public servants who are collaborating, right? Working in partnership. And that's what's really been happening every month with all of the law enforcement agencies, the prosecutors, our SOS program, and our SANE nurse program. All of that, we are collaborating. We're coming up with ideas about better training and implementing that, and also holding ourselves accountable because we've created a checklist to make sure that all of the various agencies and all of our promises are being kept. So I'm really excited to turn this over to the speakers here because we got a lot of them, but you'll see the passion and the dedication with respect to this work, and you'll be able to see some of the positive outcomes. So if we can go to the next slide, and I believe that I'll be handing this over to Jessica O'Hearn, who I just think has done a really marvelous job within our Sheriff's Office. And I couldn't be happier today to know that we're gonna be able to keep her in her position for the next 2 years because we got that grant. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jessica.
I'm actually going to stop.
Oh, was it you, Karen?
Pop in first. Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries at
And
all.
I couldn't be happier about Karen Kugler, who has just done a wonderful job of working with all of our law enforcement agencies to be that prosecutor that they can talk to talk about these cases. And Karen, you have made a world of a difference.
I appreciate that, John. As John was talking about, so I'm one of two, and we'll get into that in a bit. My colleague Don Baxton and I are a team that are working really hard on the implementation plan and making sure these hard cases are getting charged and prosecuted, and working with investigators. So the enormity of the tasks that are set forth in the implementation plan that the police agencies across the county all agreed to accepting responsibility for really required some measure of accountability. And in order to really try to track that accountability and make sure that everybody was following through on that commitment for change, we created a checklist that measures the various points within the implementation plan that are necessary to increase and improve our work across the county. So some of the highlights of data that we began collecting on January 1st of 2020 include tracking of race and gender, include tracking the date of the incident, when that incident was reported to police, and how fast police responded. all really important measures that show that the response time of police to victims and making sure that they're following up in person and maintaining contact with victims really ensures or helps to ensure that cases will be seen all the way through the criminal justice process. So we wanted to make sure that we're following those best practices and tracking that. So these checklists are filled out for each and every case by the investigators. The checklist also includes whether a sexual assault examination was completed on the victim, and significantly as well, whether or not a suspect sexual assault exam was completed. We have really tight timelines that those can be done, but it was really shown through the research that was done that developed this implementation plan that some of the agencies and some of the efforts that were made were kind of missing out on these steps. And so we wanted to really highlight the significance of the evidence that can be gained through these efforts. And a suspect, is really a huge potential of evidence there, just as a victim is. And so we want to make sure that we're collecting that evidence. So now we're tracking it and making sure. And you'll see, John will go over results with you in a little bit, but remarkable efforts have been made in that respect. We also are tracking significantly whether or not community advocates are involved. You'll hear from SOS. Pahua will be speaking with you a little bit later, but the involvement of SOS has been absolutely critical, and that helps so much, again, with keeping the victims engaged in the process. So we're working hard to collect this data so that we can have some measure of accountability. The checklists are sent into our office, and then our office compiles the data, and we'll give you the results that are going to be forthcoming today. I can give you one result right now if you want to switch to the next slide. We know, I guess that slide has been moved. So I'm going to turn it over to Jessica, or actually back to John, I believe, to talk about this, the checklist return rates that are occurring.
Karen, I think on slide 8 and slide 9, or I think 9 is the one that you're wanted to talk about. I think this slide 8, to go back to it real quick, is just basically now we're doing the checklist, and these are just the checklists that are returned. So people are doing it starting as of January of 2020. So that's just a good sign. So I think the next slide is what you were going to talk about.
You're right. The next slide I was going to talk about is the advocates have now been invited to 46.5% of the cases where there's a follow-up interview with a victim. And to put that in context for you, I believe it was under 10% originally, somewhere in the 7% range originally before this project began. So there's been a massive increase in an effort to make sure that we have a community advocate invited to these meetings with the victims so that we can establish that support that's really unrelated, it's tangentially related, but not direct law enforcement or not direct prosecutor, which can so many times be scary to a victim or stifling to a victim. But there's been a lot of effort made, and we are absolutely committed to improving that number. We've had some impact this year with obviously COVID and all of the problems with COVID. There are also geographical constraints that impact that. Sometimes victims don't want an advocate there. So there are other things that happen that can impact that number. So I don't think realistically we'll ever get to 100%, but we're going to work on getting pretty darn close. So that's our effort there. And then one comment on the checklist, and that was my bad. I flipped the slides in my own head. But the checklists that are being returned by law enforcement have gone through many stages and morphs, and our brilliant Brielle Bernardi, who created or is capturing all that data for us, now has it in an electronic form. So it takes minimal time and effort by law enforcement. So we're not distracting them with data collection. They can pop on, they can fill out a form electronically, and it takes just minutes. So from that, I will pass it on to Jessica O'Hearn, who has been a great partner to our office in making sure that law enforcement is on board with everything we're doing.
Thank you. Yes, Jessica O'Hearn with the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department. I am the sexual assault investigator. So when we started looking at some of our data, when we started all this, we realized that we were not doing a lot of suspect exams. And this is across the board with every agency in the county. As you can see, we only did 6 suspect exams total for all of us from 2013 to 2016, which is not very good in my standards, and I think many others too. Since then, though, this last year, we did 48 suspect exams in 2020, and we're hoping to do more now with COVID kind of slowing down in 2021. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So some of the stuff that we have now been capturing with the checklist that we've done, we're inviting obviously more advocates to our interviews. Cases are being assigned to investigators a lot more quick lately. Some of us are doing 24-hour turnarounds with our investigations for reaching out to our victims. More investigators are completing these forensic suspect exams. St. Paul PD was actually very instrumental in figuring out a great draft for search warrants for suspect exams. And all of us investigators throughout the county now have this suspect exam model that we go off of. And more cases are being referred to for charging. And also, we're also able to reach out to Karen, usually at the county attorney's office, in case we have questions about our difficult cases. I've called her at 10, 11 o'clock at night before for cases, and she's always there willing to help me on any of my cases needed. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So one of the things that came out of everything is we have a work group that we meet every month, an hour and a half each month. And we've put together some 4-hour trainings that almost everybody, it's actually 9 out of 10 now, or sorry, 8 out of 9 counties, agencies have now had all their training on the sexual assault response. We have 1 more to go. Because of COVID, we were supposed to have all that live, but instead we did a couple Zoom meetings and we put them all on some CDs and we mailed them out to each agency. So each agency was able to get all of their investigators and all the other officers trained and up to speed with this. We're doing a lot more search warrants. We're able to collect a lot more digital evidence. And a lot of this is coming out of our training now that we have done. We have created a countywide listserv, which has all of us investigators that work on sexual assaults and also the county attorney's office on board too. And that way we can bounce stuff off of each other. Any new law updates and stuff go to all of us right away. And like I said, at the bottom here, we've increased case consultations between investigators. I've had other investigators from the county give me a call late at night asking me questions about stuff. I've called people too. That way we always have somebody there to bounce something off of in case one of us don't know. And now I believe it's going to go over to Dawn or maybe back to Karen.
Karen, you're on mute.
Back up. All right, back to me for one brief slide, and just to give you the sense of what's happening specifically in our office out. John Choi, through this work, has designated I'm the specialized prosecutor to work with law enforcement and to charge some of the more difficult cases. I look at cases 13 and above and focus on the cases that are really hard, that a lot of times in the past maybe there would have been an automatic no to. I also take a look at second look requests for those types of cases that maybe were declined in the past, and I'll give them a second look to see, is there any way that we can possibly prosecute this case? And I work with investigators to kind of shore up some of the holes that have led to the declines traditionally in the past and fill those gaps in so that when they get to the trial attorneys have all the ammunition they need to go forward and prosecute a case. Once I get done kind of with my piece and the case gets charged, many of the cases, not all because there's not enough capacity for that, but my colleague and partner in justice, Dawn Baxt, is the trial attorney to handle those really hard, high challenging, high risk CSC cases. So she'll take over on those. one of the issues that we realized too, coming out of our office, because it's accountability for us as well as everybody else, right? And so we realized that some of these CSD cases had been sitting for a while because there were so many cases that were coming into our office. And so I've taken on the responsibility of charging a lot of the cases on CSCs for those 13 and up cases, and some other times younger children, but that has really helped reduce the overall time from the law enforcement submission to our office to getting the case decision on charging or not being able to charge it. Our charging rate has increased. John will go over that with you later, but working these cases in the way that we are now is really helping us take a very aggressive approach to the criminal sexual conduct cases. We're also trying to be really progressive with our training and paying attention to national trainings that are happening and making sure that that stuff is all brought home to Ramsey County, and that all investigators and all prosecutors are properly and continually trained. We've developed guidelines so that people have ongoing training, and our office does a biannual training now for law enforcement, started in 2007 by my predecessor, Karen Long, and then I took over in 2019, and we'll have another one this year. And we plan on keeping that going forward, but we also have several trainings throughout the year that we assist with. You can go to the next slide. John, you're up.
Yes, and so I'm going to go over some of the numbers, and I want to just really make it clear that, as we think about justice, it's not like a basketball game, right? But I think numbers can help us understand trends and to understand kind of the health of the response. And so the very first thing that we thought that is really critical, because as you recall, before we did the report, what we kind of knew and why we wanted to do the report is that we knew that law enforcement would get complaints or incidents presented to them from victims, but many of those investigations did not actually come to us, right? And so we've been having some really important dialogue and conversation about like what kind of cases you should send to us. Don't assume that we don't want to see that or work with that. So what this first number represents is just the referrals coming from law enforcement. And I think that's really important because that's one of the things that we said fundamentally we needed to change. And so as you can see from, if we started with 2017, that number has increased, whether it's we're talking about victims over the age of 13 or all victims of criminal sexual conduct. I think it's also important to point out that 2020 was a pandemic year, and we do know that overall reporting of criminal sexual conduct has been down, not only in this community, but also in the nation. But at least these cases are now coming to us. And then if we could go to the next slide, I think it's just a reflection of the cases charged and the cases declined. So the charged cases are in blue. The red represents the decline, which is just the sum total of your previous slide. But then if we look to the next slide, I think this is the one that I really tells me something. So our overall charging rate in this office as it relates to all crimes, okay, historically, since I've been the county attorney, has always been about 60%. So 60% of the cases that police refer to us, we charge. The 40% we either decline because of insufficient evidence. We might believe that the case should be prosecuted at a lower level by a city attorney because we don't have the elements of the crime, et cetera, right? And so if 60% is kind of the where we want to be, so that this crime of criminal sexual conduct is just like any other crime. And that's the whole premise by Start By Believing, that my greatest wish in all of this is that the experience that a victim will have when they, after something horrible has happened to them and they decide to tell someone, and of course, for us, what we can control is the system response. So when police respond, that they'll be treated just like as if it were somebody had broken into my home and stole something from my home, right? And so we want to make sure that response is just like that. And so what we see here in terms of a charge rate, which is the blue line, is that charging percentage, even despite the fact that we've asked for all of these cases to come to our office, getting closer to that 50% mark, and eventually it'll be surpassing that 50% mark. And my hope and dream is that this case or this category of offense will be just like any other crime. And that to me tells me that we've corrected something, that we're healthy in terms of our response. And of course, there's other things that we could look at. And this is just one particular data point. So if we could just go to the next slide. And then, of course, too, I think because of just some of the great data capacity that we have, and Brielle Bernardi helps us with that, race matters. And it's great that more law enforcement agencies are providing this data to us so that we can start looking at this. And so one of the things that we can see here, and I think it's really shown more on the next slide, is that we have disparities that we need to think about, and we need to try to do a better job on as it relates to encouraging communities to know that they live in a started by believing community, that we can create a culture that will be supportive, and that we're going to have a response, a system response that is going to be centered around victims, but also cultural aspects of how victims will present. And so this is just some of the disparities of data that we have, and we're going to continue to track it because it's important as we are aware of this, and then also thinking about how we can actually serve all victims better. So if we can go to the next slide, I think we're going to transition to advocacy, and this is where Puhua comes in. And I know that Puhua is going to present these slides, but I also want to take this opportunity to really give a shout out to Emily Heeman, who has been involved in this work since its inception, and even before that, decades in her work around SOS. So I just wanted to call her out, as well as the public health department overall, because you've been such a great partner in all of this, because quite frankly, we can't just solve these problems by just arresting and prosecuting. Doing a better job in that bucket. We need to do a better job in the prevention piece and the advocacy through our SOS program, and also creating and building a more better cultural response for all of our victims. So Puhua, I think you're up, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Thank you, John. So I first just wanted to frame sexual violence as a public health issue. That is something that not only affects victim survivors, but their friends, families, work, school. And the reality is that we all know someone, whether or not they've disclosed that to us. And so with about 25 million estimated survivors in the US right now, we can expect to spend more than $3 trillion over their lifetimes on things like healthcare, criminal justice response, lost productivity, and other costs. And so that's why it's so important to invest in this work, not only to respond, but to prevent sexual violence, because the reality is that sexual violence is preventable. So here at SOS, we have a team of about 6 direct service staff who provide free and confidential services to victim survivors in Ramsey County through our 24-hour crisis line, in person, at courts. And we basically meet victim survivors where they want us to. And so as advocates, we're not there to tell victim survivors what to do or what to say. We're there to give them information and tools. They get to make the decisions for themselves, and we're there to just support them through the process. And we also do a lot of other things too. So what I wanted to highlight is that SOS Sexual Violence Services, we are not just there for the criminal justice advocacy response. We're there to support a victim survivor in all of their experiences and support them in many other aspects too. But today we'll be focusing on the criminal justice aspect. So next slide. So another thing too is the COVID impact. So 2020 kind of threw us all into a loop, and it has also affected all of our services too. So sexual violence, we do know that it is one of the most underreported crimes. It's estimated that less than 20% even report to law enforcement. And so we also know that with COVID, with less social gatherings and in-person interactions, we've seen less reports of many types of crimes, not just sexual violence. And so what I want to highlight here is that it's important that we are mindful about how we speak about language and potential victim blaming narratives. So for example, with the closing of bars, we saw a decrease in bar-related sexual assaults, but we also saw a decrease in bar-related fights, underage drinking, fake IDs. And so we have to be mindful not to perpetuate any underlying assumptions that drinking in bars cause sexual assault, because reality is that sexual assault can happen to anyone, anywhere, and the responsibility of the assault falls on the person who committed the harm and not the victim. We also had callers who were fearful of COVID, so they didn't go to the hospitals for the sexual assault exams. We had victim survivors who had to shelter in place with their abusers or had to engage in survival sex to meet their basic needs. With distance learning in schools too, that became much more difficult for teachers to be able to identify any risk factors from the students. That also meant less access to services. In-person advocacy and other social services were disrupted or canceled. And so a lot of services had to turn into virtual services, which also left a lot of accessibility issues for people who didn't have access to that or whose devices were being monitored. And with the delay of the courts, the impact on the victim survivor has been extremely hard, especially in terms of their healing. Though we know that the court process already takes several months, and for that to be extended even further with COVID has really taken a toll on the mental health and well-being of victim survivors as well. So next slide. So just criminal justice advocacy, research tells us that when an advocate is involved, victim survivors are more likely to stay engaged in the criminal justice process and are less likely to experience secondary victimization. So what does criminal justice advocacy look like? It could look like anything from just providing information on victim survivor rights, all the way to attending court with them, law enforcement interviews, and assisting with reparations and victim impact statement and such. So those are just some of those things. We can go to the next slide. So I wanted to highlight SOS services. So in 2017, we saw that about 517 of our total services or interactions with victim survivors involve some sort of criminal justice service. So those bullet points that we saw on the previous slide, that was about 58% of our total services in 2017 involved some sort of criminal justice component. In 2019, about 78% of our services involve some sort of criminal justice service. But when we look at just the raw numbers of from 500 to 980, almost 1,000, that's basically almost twice as much that we are providing services as it relates to criminal justice services. Now our goal isn't necessarily to make that 100, because our goal is really to let the victim survivors freely choose what it is that they want to do. And so if a victim survivor just calls and says they just only want information about support groups and not criminal justice services, we're not going to push that. But we also know that having advocates involved, and when we've been able to explain that process, we've seen a lot of people who do decide later that they do want to go through the process. So we can go to the next slide. Here, this really shows shows the depth of services that we've been able to provide victim survivors. So in 2017, a victim survivor received on average 3.9 services that are related to criminal justice services. In 2019, the average victim survivor received about 8.5 of those services. And that was also at the end of 2018 into 2019 was also when the county invested in 2 more additional SOS advocates to make that happen. And so again, 2020, some of the COVID impacts that we explained below, we kind of see that drop a little bit too. And go to the next one. And actually, I want to go to the next one and then come back to this one, if that's okay. So then, so this one is the number of in-person investigative interviews done at a law enforcement agency where an SOS advocate was present. So in 2017 was when we started engaging in different conversations and started tracking that data of where SOS is engaged with victim survivors in person at the law enforcement agencies. So in 2017, we went to 14 investigative interviews, and by 2019, that was 118. So that is almost 8 times more than what we had seen before in just a span of 2 years. So again, this really only looks at in-person investigative interviews, so it doesn't include interviews that were conducted offsite, like at shelters or at SOS office. And then for 2020, those 32 that we see there were primarily from the beginning of the quarter before we're in the pandemic. So I'll go to the previous slide if we can about the race. So we have here data of SOS primary victims and their racial demographics. So about 2/3 of our clients, we do know their race. And so this is what's reflected in here. So I just have here in teal that's reflected is the SOS known race population proportion. And in orange, there is the Ramsey County's population. So we can see there are some different gaps in those services. And then we can jump into the other slide. And so here's another graph that depicts the disparity index here. So what we do see here with our data is that for the people who've accessed our SOS services, Indigenous residents are 3.9 times more likely to be a victim of sexual assault as compared to white residents. For multiracial residents, that's 2.7, and for Black African American residents, that's 2.2 times. So what is important to highlight here is that we really do need to invest more in our diverse communities. The experience of sexual violence looks different across all communities. And so that would look like also investing in more staff throughout our criminal justice systems that reflect our residents, and also creating a safe environment for diverse victims and survivors to be able to engage in these systems to provide to really build and create the changes that we are needing going forward. So we can go to the next slide. And I believe this is Dawn.
It is, yes, thank you. Hi, as has been mentioned, I'm Dawn Bax. I'm the other half of the Karen and Dawn duo. So in the county attorney's office, after Karen reviews and charges a case, it comes to me for trial. This means that my entire caseload is comprised of cases that would not have existed several years ago, right? These are cases that would have historically been undercharged or not charged charged at all. So for as beautifully as the data is presented here, and as important as these metrics are in showing the progress that has been made, it can't be overstated how important it is that each of these numbers represent a person, right? Each number represents a survivor. And sexual assault is an intimate violence. It affects victims differently than other kinds of crimes. And so one of the primary focuses is that it is a victim-centered approach. And the mantra in being sure we honor this victim-centered approach is defining success. So each time I meet with a survivor for the first time, we have a conversation about defining success. And because sexual assault is such an intimate crime, that can look a lot of different ways. For some survivors, success is their offender leaving the college campus so that the survivor can stay. For some, it is being matched with mental health services or treatment options. For some, it is finding stable housing. So the justice system, the case itself, almost takes on a far smaller role than one might imagine. And so it was with this in mind that I met a survivor by the name of Veronica in 2019. And she was a young woman, late teens. She had been sexually assaulted by the son of her mom's best friend. And she knew right away that success for her was going to trial and telling the jury and telling the community, the public out loud what had happened to her. And there were pitfalls in going to trial for sure. She'd had some of her own mental health struggles in the past, and there was concern that those might be made part of the trial. As I mentioned, the mothers of the victim and the defendant were best friends, so there were challenges there. And of course, just the process of trial itself, right? Retelling what it is that happened and subjecting oneself to cross-examination. And Veronica was a survivor that we would say did everything right. She reported right away. Her reporting was consistent and it was thorough and detailed. She participated in the process. Her testimony at trial was consistent with what had been reported to police. She had not been under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the time of the assault. So some of these challenges that sometimes arise in cases were not part of this case. So she testified, there was a jury trial, and despite everything having gone really well, the jury returned a not guilty verdict. And as you can imagine, this was really disappointing for Veronica as well as our entire team. And she left court feeling pretty down and as though the success of participating in trial had not been fully realized because of that verdict. But as time went on, we stayed in touch with Veronica. She had the services of SOS as well as an advocate in our office. And she's just such a shining star because she redefined success for herself. And after she had some time and some distance from the trial and her experience in the justice system, she came to realize that she had found her voice. She had regained her strength and her confidence. And that was because she did this hard thing, but also she talked about walking into a courtroom and seeing her advocates there to support her, that they believed her from the very beginning, that Jessica O'Hearn knew how to take a proper statement from a sexual assault victim, that she saw a prosecutor standing up in court and fighting for her. And so ultimately she felt that this experience was a success, but this is the quality of how we handle these cases. And it just has to be an integral part of measuring the quantity of cases. She is an important part of this culture shift. So while we are working on a macro level to improve our processes and our responses, each and every survivor is a way of measuring success on a micro level. She now takes her experience out into the community. She speaks to other survivors when she talks and to potential future survivors. And so part of the culture shift is getting the message out there, not just from our agencies, but from survivors, that when a person is sexually assaulted, that the systems are in place to handle the case sensitively and appropriately and thoroughly. So on behalf of those survivors, I just can't thank you enough for your interest and your support. What we are able to do because of your engagement is making all of the difference. And so now I think Ellen is taking over.
Yep. So I just want to call out the fact that we are so privileged to be able to work with such a focused and dedicated group of professionals. It is such a joy to sit on these teams and to participate in all of these process improvements. And one of our shining stars in our team is Melissa Jackson, and she sits on the implementation team and is able to provide input from the medical forensic perspective to the team. We had the opportunity to create a process where we could implement the new statute that directs the BCA to store kits from restricted cases, from unreported cases for 30 months. And we shared this process with law enforcement and all of our community partners at our March multidisciplinary meeting. And it really helps the group to understand what happens and how it plays out when a victim of sexual assault decides to report after the sexual assault exam and evidence has been collected. So this has been our most recent effort to collaborate and provide education for community partners. Next slide. A really long-term collaboration was with St. Paul PD sex crimes team. We met monthly for a year to fine-tune the suspect exam process. We improved the process from the SANE perspective, simplified our charting so that we wouldn't be stepping on the toes of law enforcement and negatively impacting their cases, and also providing input to the St. Paul Sex Crimes Unit by providing a suspect exam guideline that was created by Amy Stays, our medical director. And she provided the scientific backing for the evidence collection timeline and the collection methods. So law enforcement would have this information to provide to judges to facilitate getting a search warrant, because this was not always a slam dunk. And the results of that year-long process, where, as Jessica mentioned, we created a guideline for obtaining a warrant as well as the information to back it up. Then all of this was shared with community partners and all of the law enforcement agencies. Next slide. And so let's look at the data. And as a comparison, in 2018 at Regions Hospital SANE program, we conducted 3 suspect exams, which actually was often more than we usually did. In the years prior to our big push in 2019, we conducted between 0 and 6 suspect exams, and 6 was a banner year. So you'll notice that in 2019, we jumped to 38 suspect exams. This was a huge jump. And this was because of the concentrated attention that suspect exams were given by both the prosecutor's office as well as law enforcement. Now, 35 of these cases were St. Paul police cases, and they have some data to be able to provide, and they've gotten the BCA results on all of these 35 cases. And what they found was that 32 of the 35 suspects that had a suspect exam, 32 of them had victim DNA on their body. This is a huge correlation between the suspect and the victim. And often there can be more DNA evidence on a suspect than a victim, which is why I am so pleased that we're putting this emphasis on suspect exams as well as victim exams. Now, as we all know, COVID put a wrench in all of our processes. And so our suspect exam numbers did go down, but not that much. We did 33 suspect exams in 2020. I don't have all of those results back, so I'm not going to talk about the DNA results from them, but it really demonstrates that there continues to be an emphasis by law enforcement on these suspect exams. And it's not just St. Paul PD that brings suspects to us. We've had suspects brought in by multiple Ramsey County agencies. And of course, it is a clear result because of the training that's been done. We are working on a project now with the Ramsey County Sheriff and St. Paul PD to move our suspect exams for suspects that require no medical treatment, which that's a majority of them, into the law enforcement center. And our target date has been May 1st. We may have to push that up to June 1st. There's a lot going on in law enforcement circles these days. But we do have a firm plan and processes put in place to be able to perform these suspect exams at the jail in the pre-booking area. So we've had the privilege of participating in ongoing education for law enforcement and other criminal justice professionals. There continues to be a huge commitment on the part of law enforcement to provide this training in sexual assault. And the first effort that we were able to participate in was with St. Paul PD. And this training was provided to every single officer in the St. Paul Police Department. And I just have to give kudos that the emphasis was placed on this 4-hour training. And since then, we've been able to, as Jessica said, participate in the training for other Ramsey County agencies with a recorded webinar format that has a reach to everybody in these times of COVID. And I believe that's on to Todd Extell.
Great. Thank you very much, Ellen. I appreciate the introduction, the great information to Chair Carter, the entire Ramsey County Board. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. And a special thank you to County Attorney Choi for your ongoing leadership with this and so many other public safety projects in our county, and specifically that impact the city of St. Paul. You know, Ramsey County provided 2 investigators to the St. Paul Police Department a couple of years ago that had a significant impact on how we do business in the St. Paul Police Department. You know, we've always been an agency where we start by believing we support our survivors of sexual assault. We do everything we possibly can with our investigators to hold offenders accountable, but it's a team approach that continues to grow. All of our service providers are working closely with us, all of our law enforcement partners throughout the county, throughout the state. Everybody seems to be at this time paddling in the same direction, and the momentum, it continues to gain steam. And ultimately, the result of that is survivors of sexual assault are being served better and offenders are being held accountable. Due to the process that has been going on for the last few years, there's been some notable changes. We have done a top to bottom review from when we received the 911 call all the way through presenting that case and trying to support victims with our service providers all the way through the end of the trial. That top to bottom review has resulted in significant improvements. When we look at the forensics exams that we just had discussed, during the years 2013 through 2018, we had conducted 10 of those exams. And you just heard the impact of those exams and how that helps the charging process and holding offenders accountable. Just in the last 2 years, that number has grown in 19 and 20 to 68 total in 2 years as compared to the 6 years prior. Now that's good, but it's not good enough. We still have, as County Attorney Choi said, we still have work to do. So we don't pretend like we've crossed the goal line and spiked the ball and we're done and it's a victory. So we're going to continue to do everything we can with all of our partners to serve our victims better. And what we do now, as John mentioned earlier, is presenting cases. We present all cases of sexual assault to the county attorney's office and Karen and team to make sure that we have all the set of eyes possible on each of these cases to make sure we're not missing anything, to make sure, again, our victims are being supported. And then you look at our cleared by arrest cases on slide number 37 here. I mean, the proof truly is in the pudding. In 2016 through 2020, as you can see, cases cleared by arrest have over doubled in those 5 years, from 16.3% all the way up to 35.7%. And that's good. But again, we don't view that as good enough. We still have a lot of work to do. And that's why I talk frequently about, police service. And when we talk about the number of officers that police agencies have throughout the county, throughout cities across the country, oftentimes that gets confused with the number of officers responding to 911 calls. And that just simply isn't true. The number of officers that we have allows us, because officers happen to be investigators, sergeants, commanders, people who support victims of crime. And when we have enough personnel to properly investigate criminal acts in support of victims, you see by this slide on number 37, more cases get cleared because of the investments made into those investigative units. So the 2 investigators added to this unit, thanks to County Attorney Choi and the entire Ramsey County Board, has produced better results for victims of crime. So we have to continue to talk about, when we talk about the number of personnel police agencies has, it's not just about answering the 9/11 call. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I will stay on the meeting here as long as I can. Have a good day.
I'm going to take over for the Sheriff's Department. I'm going to talk a little bit about the grant that we've had for the last 2 years with the County Attorney's Office. We had a chance to kind of do some new stuff and see if it worked and didn't work. And I think most of the stuff has worked. We implemented right away that the deputies were to contact me to determine if I needed to come in to respond to the scene or to the hospital. If the victim's going to the hospital, I've been able to respond to the hospital right away to talk with them and help gather some evidence. All the victims are contacted within 24 hours of the time the call gets in pending by me as for follow-up. And then we've also even implemented that every 30 days, the victims are given an update on their case, whether it's through me or through at least SOS, who I talk with, I think, almost on a daily basis. I've had SOS invited to each investigation so far. And during COVID, we kind of got a little, it was difficult, I'll just say that. But I had them a lot on FaceTime on my phone with the victims sitting across from me. I did a lot of interviews outside. I have a picnic table out here at the patrol station. That's where we did a lot of our interviews till it got cold. We did Zoom stuff, we did Teams, quite a bunch of different other things, but all of our victims were able to meet at least, not face to face, but at least Zoom or any other way through during this COVID time. One of the other things we did was with all of our new procedures that we did here at the Sheriff's Department, we had every Sheriff's Department sworn officer trained with all our new guidelines within the first couple months of the grant 2 years ago. And then all of my cases go to Karen Kugler for review, and we discuss if I need to do some follow-up or if they're good to go. But every one of those cases now have been looked at by Karen at this point. Go to the next slide. So these are a couple things that we did implement. On the patrol side, we did a patrol checklist. This is just a checklist for the patrol officers to make sure that they're not missing any evidence on scene. A lot of our digital evidence obviously can go away right away. So our patrol officers are able to grab some of that right away. And since we're starting this new grant, I did send it out to all the officers to see if they wanted to change this, and everybody said that they actually like doing this. So we're going to keep doing this checklist. And then the other checklist is something I created myself, just so I was making sure I was making my deadlines with contacting the victim within 24 hours, getting a hold of SOS, figuring out a final disposition on the case, stuff like that. So that's another thing. I'm going to tweak it a little bit for the new grant, but I'm going to keep doing that too. So we keep having more data collected to figure out if what we're doing is working. Next slide. And this is just a couple bar graph here of how our caseload works. As you can see, COVID time, I had 112 sexual assault cases versus 2019, 132 cases. My caseload did not go down that much. And this year it's just going up. So I don't think COVID impacted me too much. The one good thing though is, as you can see, since we started the grant, we are going up in getting our cases charged, and we're getting a lot more better outcomes too with trials at this point too. And I think it has to start with us here at the Sheriff's Department. We're making sure with patrol, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and then passing off to the attorney's office who are able to close the deal for us for these cases. Next slide. And I'll put it over to Chief Scheider.
Great, thank you. And Thank you for having me here today to talk about some of the important work we're doing here in Roseville. And I just want to start off thanking John Choi for his commitment to improving outcomes in these cases. It's so important. And I'm really proud of the progress we've made. There's obviously still a lot of work that needs to be done, but this would not have been possible without the funding that we received through the County Attorney's Office. In August 2019, the Roseville City Council approved a one-year grant proposal, and that was originally funded for 1 year by the County Attorney's Office. And prior to that, we had one detective that was handling all of our sexual assaults and domestics. And so that person really was just, it was too much. And with this grant, we were able to show that this will improve outcomes by dedicating resources. As our council had agreed in 2020, they agreed to continue this position permanently. So we've got that in our budget each year. And some of the other highlights that we were able to implement because of that commitment made by the County Attorney's Office is, as others have mentioned, we have all of our officers have completed the sexual assault training that focuses on a victim-centered approach, which is so important. We've also been able to get our sexual assault detective to a number of trainings, which previously trying to do domestics and sexual assault, it really was just too much, where now we can really focus on getting some of that specialized training, as well as collaboration with our partners throughout Ramsey County. Even with COVID, we've been able to still focus on in-person interviews whenever possible, or trying to getting creative when we need to. And then another part of this that we were able to do is we took a comprehensive review of our policy, and a new sexual assault policy was implemented. Our focus really has been involving advocacy throughout the investigation and improved data collection to really be able to measure success. And it is hard with just numbers, but I think as we go through a couple of the slides today, you'll see that we are seeing progress in how these cases are handled, as well as the outcomes. And just as others have mentioned, obviously there's still a lot of work left to do. This wasn't the goal line, it was just making some progress and then continuing that. The next couple slides I'm going to go through really quickly. We've got a full report that we posted on our city police department website, so you can certainly go there for more information, but just a couple things to kind of highlight. And then I think there's some summary slides that do even a better job of kind of showing where we started and where we're at. In this slide here, in 2018, we looked at our advocacy and we found that it was offered in about 45% of the cases. That's a graph on the left, which is less than half. And then we found that in-person interviews were done in about a third of the cases, so about 33%. If you go to the next slide, the other measures that we were looking at is SANE and suspect exams. In 2018, we found that SANE exams were completed in 18% of the cases. So we really started to dig into how we can improve that as we move forward. And we kind of found the most common reason was the detectives didn't feel there was any evidentiary value or not enough probable cause. And we did not have any suspect exams performed in 2018. Just flip to the next slide, you'll start to see some of that work that we started doing in 2019. We found that advocacy was offered in 63% of the cases, and that was an increase. And so that's what we were really aiming to accomplish. And then we found a slight increase in in-person interviews. On the next slide, we also in 2019 looked at our SANE and suspect exams, and we found that SANE exams were completed in 57% of the cases, which was up from 45% from the year before. We did not have any suspect exams in 2019. And then when you get to 2020, I'll just quick touch upon these numbers before we kind of look at the summary. And we found that advocacy in 2020 was offered in 73% of the cases. And this was an increase over the last 2 years. And obviously, as others have mentioned, with COVID, it did impact our in-person interviews. And then the next slide just kind of gets into the 2020 stats for SANE and suspect exams. And some of these numbers were a little skewed because there was a new state law that went into effect that kind of, it's hard to make a year-to-year comparison, but we are still finding that we're making progress on that as well. And I think the slide that I really wanted to focus on, I know I went through a lot of information quickly, but is when you look at the comparison between 2018 and 2020, we are seeing progress. The slide on the left, if you look, advocacy is the red line, and then you look at in-person interviews, and both of those are increasing. And And again, the SANE exams are increasing, but the data was slightly skewed by some changing in reporting. If you remove those, we are still finding our SANE exam rate is going up. If you look at the slide at the right, it shows a comparison with the involvement of advocacy following in-person interviews or child forensic interviews. And we know that advocacy is so important to keeping victims engaged. So that trend line is where we want to see it going. Obviously still work to be done though. And then if you go to just the last slide, if you look at the upper left-hand graph, you'll see that since 2018, we're sending more cases to the county attorney for review. All of our cases go down. And that was something that we had identified early on that was really important, as we needed to make sure to have everyone involved, not just the detective making that determination that there wasn't enough, but being able to send it to the county attorney and work with them on what other information might be helpful to pursue charges. And I think this graph also on the upper left reinforces how important advocacy is to keeping victims engaged in the process. If you look at the graph on the lower left, that one shows that this work really is making a difference. In 2018, 33% of the cases we presented to the Ramsey County Attorney's Office were charged. And when you look at 2020, that's up to 44%. And also keeping in mind, we're sending a lot more cases down as well. And again, as I mentioned, we really proud of the progress that's been made through the work of the county attorney and all of our partners here in Ramsey County, but we also recognize there's still a lot of work that's left to be done. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
And I think that's me, am I right? Probably, I think. I hope so. So there was a lot of information, but I hope the commissioners here can see the depth and of the commitment and just the collaboration that's been happening. I couldn't be more proud of all of the people that are assembled here, and there's still others in other agencies too that are a part of all of this as well. So we have a lot more work to do. I don't want that to get lost. One of the areas that we need to focus on and will continue to focus on is just looking at victim attrition, because one of the things that the 2018 report emphasized was that we had a high dropout rate. And so we need to keep working on that. And we're doing a whole bunch of things. But the whole theme of all of this is, I think, a lot of increased collaboration, creating a task force. And then also too, I want to make this really clear, because I know that this is an important value of the Board of Commissioners, that we really want to think about and to act on how we can advance race equity and address some of the disparities that we see showing up with our victim survivors. That means that we need to gain more proximity and get connected to those communities so that we can think about how we can improve those outcomes. And I think there's some strategies that certainly can be on the system response side, but also on the public health side. And so I'm looking forward to some of those conversations. And, so all of this work continues. But I also wanted to, at this time, Mr. Chairman Ortega, if it would be also okay, because we invited Artika Roller, who is the executive director of MINCASA, the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault, just to say some brief remarks about having heard all of this information, as she leads an organization and a coalition of advocacy organizations and service providers serving victim survivors of sexual assault across the state, to kind of have some thoughts really quickly, and then we can go into some questions.
By all means, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Artika, are you there, I hope?
Yes, I'm here, John. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and commissioners, and John, for this invitation to hear about the amazing work. Again, I'm Artika Roller. I am the executive director of MINCASA, and I have been in that role for about 15 months. And in those 15 months, I had the pleasure of working with many of you, and I've worked with quite a few of you prior to coming to MINCASA. And I didn't know what I was getting into 15 months. I would have never expected that we would be in the middle of COVID and our work would have changed and we would be looking at how we provide services in a different way. I am more than thrilled to hear the impact and the outcomes that you have achieved in such a short period of time. I've had the opportunity of working with the county and also for a county. And one of the things that we always say is that change is slow. But within such a short period of time, there has been significant change. And I think that under John's leadership, those changes, you kind of have the secret sauce of when you look at system change and you have a good leader, the right people on board, a solid team, and then the inclusion of your stakeholders. And so that graph that showed how advocacy is really working and been involved, just so important to the work. At Mendoza, our primary focus is making sure that we have victims and survivors at the center of everything that we do. And that had really showed through the work and what you guys are doing. So I want to thank you for that. I think my last words are a couple last words is that I look forward to a partnership and meeting and working with you, all of you, in my continued work with Vincasa. But my work with victims of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking is actually how I originally met John many years ago. And but we would leave our meetings, our staff meetings, and we would say, what would the participants of our programs think about the staff meeting and the work that we would do? And we would be honest and have that conversation. And most of the time, I want to say, we would say they would feel good about the work that we did. There's other times where we would say they would believe that we should be tweaking this and doing this differently. I believe with my work with victims and survivors that they would have been more than impressed with the work that you guys have achieved over the past few years with this report. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martika. I want to echo what John said. This is a wonderful report, quite frankly. I was just just into it. The collaboration and the results are fantastic. I don't even know what to say, but what a wonderful job everybody's done. I have several hands up. I'll start with Trista.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And wow, I am really impressed. I mean, the attitude shift and the start by believing really is a game changer. I have worked, sorry.
You're muted, Trista. Trista, you're mute.
That's probably a good thing, as I was choking up anyway and you couldn't hear me. I just want to say thank you. The shift in attitude, the start by believing, and for everyone responding to believe first is huge. I mean, that alone is going to make all the difference. Most of you know I'm a survivor, and I wish all of you had been around 20 years ago, because my life would have certainly been different. And I just think it's so amazing, the work that you're doing. Really, thank you. And I would echo Artika, survivors would be impressed. I know that I am. This is really important work. And it is just, it's really incredible. The questions I actually have a couple questions. I love that you're breaking it down by our racial impacts and the disparities, because it's really important to understand that. I'm wondering about our GLBTQ community. I think that we know that that is a higher impact community, but would love to know how we are addressing that particular community in our work and as we move forward and collecting data there as well. And because we know that gender identity is not just, it's not just women that are victims, right? And it's all genders. and to really pay attention to that and do the same kind of thoughtful preparation and training around multiple gender identities as well. And then my other question is, I come out of the military where I worked as an advocate against military sexual trauma. And I'm wondering, when I saw the list of partner agencies, I did not see the Minnesota National Guard. And so I'm wondering where we have partnered with their headquarters in Ramsey County. We have multiple armories in Ramsey County. And unfortunately, in the last year, we've had a significant amount of state active duty. And I know for sure and have already heard that there have been sexual assaults during that active duty time, and it may have occurred in our county. And so I'm wondering about how we expand that partnership and investigations and treating those soldiers that are in Ramsey County that might have that same experience.
So I think a number of people might have an answer. Maybe I'll start it off, but I think maybe Pahua, I know you would have something to add too. So I just, first of all, Commissioner Maez-Castillo, thank you for your sharing and your thoughts here. I was very moved just by the fact that you were moved. But the issues that you're raising, I think, are important ones. And I think that we need to go beyond looking at things just from a race equity perspective, but also to lift up some of the issues that you're talking about. I don't know exactly, I'd have to think about this, about how you get that data in the context of police reports. I'm not certain that police necessarily might be asking that question. So I'm just all open and all ears to try to think about how to incorporate that into not only our data collection, but also to kind of how we're going to show up and think about investigating these situations and then doing something if it requires a prosecution, and having the best information, training, and perspective so that we can be able to relate and serve across, not just race, but also gender, et cetera. So thank you for that. With regard to the Minnesota Guard and the Armory, I don't know that we would have jurisdiction over things that would necessarily happen there. And so I think that's probably one of the reasons why they're not a part of this collaboration. But I could be wrong. I just don't.
Yeah, we changed the law about 4 years ago that all sexual assaults in the Guard have to be reported to local jurisdictions.
Oh.
And so you do, in fact, and because local jurisdictions haven't necessarily taken that next step to partner, the Guard is actually requesting BCA to investigate. I would say the advocates in the Guard are asking that, not the Guard leadership, but you actually do have jurisdiction over any sexual assault that occurred.
So thank you for that. Again, another great point. And I'm very open to wanting to learn more and to follow up on that. And so I'll certainly make the commitment that, as a part of this group, we'll think about those two issues that you identified, and then also report back to you as a part of just this work that we're doing, because I think you raised really good issues that we should be thinking about. I don't know if public health has a thought about this too.
Yeah, so we do know that we've served victim survivors who have been assaulted in the military and have kind of gone through that process too. But you are right that we do need to strengthen that partnership more on a systems level. If you do have a good contact, I'd be glad to connect them to the Ramsey County Sexual Assault Protocol team, get them more involved in that team as well. I know we've had a contact with National Guard too, with some other things that are specific to SOS events and whatnot. The other question you had about serving queer identifying survivors, most of our database right now is designed in a way that is designed to meet our grant requirements. And so we are kind of updating that because, the gender options are male, female, and sometimes other. And so we are expanding on that. We are mindful of people's pronouns usage, and we do refer people to services that are queer, affirming, or friendly. And we do have a partnership with Reclaim 2, which serves queer youth for the mental health needs and whatnot. So that's definitely something that we are aware of, and definitely something that if you would like, we can pull up more data and information too. We just didn't have that readily available today.
Thank you. Tony?
Thank you. Thanks so much. I just wanted to make a few comments. I have to leave in just a few minutes, but I was just thrilled to see the work that has been done. There are a lot of slides here and just great information about the work that has been done over the past 18 months. You know, the first slide talks about the 9 agencies, the County Attorney's Office and SOS, 44 improvement efforts, 18 months of work that you've been doing. And I would certainly add a ton of results and relationships that have been formed around this critical work. Thank you so very much. And I want to thank also all who have contributed. Certainly our County Attorney, Commissioner McDonough, thank you for your voice early on as well. You mentioned Emily Heyman and all that are on this call. It's wonderful to see the separate reports all attributing to the results that have been achieved because of your coming together and because of the dedicated work. I also wanted to ask, I know that, you know, the results are good, to see them and hear them from the separate agencies is great. I know you're collecting the data and reporting, each of you, to show the results. Is there also a portion of this that is going to be around combining those results, being able to share the same language as we look to the future, which would certainly be very, very helpful? There were questions that I had just because of my ignorance. You know, are cases charged and cases arrested the same, that kind of thing, as we look in the flow of information from one to the other. That may be something you can answer today. I got it. You know, the results are clear, but I'm just wondering if that combined data is something we can look forward to as well over time. And thank you so many of you, all of you, I should say, for being here today to share with us the importance of this work to you.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, John.
Thank you, Commissioner Carter. I was just wanting to respond to, again, another great point by the commissioners. I think you raised something that is kind of obvious about the PowerPoint, is that you've got databases from different agencies, et cetera, right? And so there's some consistency, obviously, with public health because it's across the board. It's public health data. You'll have consistency from ours, but then with respect to maybe police agencies, they will be collecting and they have a different types of infrastructure a little bit, but I think there are some common things. So I think, you know, in the future, we'll try to see if there's ways to try to pull that all together so it can, because, you know, we talked about suspect examinations and you got data from regions and you got data from the entire county. And so all of the data is correct. But you have to do some simple math to add it all up so that it gets to that particular number. So I think that's just the challenge of deciding kind of a little bit later to add in some specific points from the various law enforcement agencies, and they put in their data. And we just didn't really simply have the time to try to pull it into one particular slide. Also, too, I thought it was important for you to hear from all of the various agencies so that you could feel the commitment from Chief Scheider and to feel the commitment from Chief Axtell and also from our Sheriff's Office, Sheriff Fletcher as well, although he wasn't here today, but I know that he's very supportive of this work. So apologies for that, but I think that you raise a good point.
No apologies necessary. I know that comes from working together over time. It comes together and it can be presented together in much more consolidated way. Just thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Mary Jo?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just add my thanks to all of you for your working together. The collaboration is really profound. I think it's impacted all of us just to see all of you on this call. And what's really impacting me is how you've internalized so much of this, like in Roseville, how you've actually put that as part of your budget now to have these people, you know, the grant came in from the county, but then you thought it was important enough to make it part of your work. And I'm just excited to see that this is being internalized and systematized into all of our work. So I think that's really important. I have a couple questions. One is at NACO, we've been, I serve on Justice and Public Safety, and we serve on Luck. And one of our commissioners that we all know, Sally Heyman, has been really promoting rape kit, the untested rape kit issue. So do we have a big issue in that? And maybe you can just refer me to that, but I know that that's becoming that's a national effort in our organization. So just curious if anyone wants to comment on how we're doing with untested rape kits.
Well, I feel like in Minnesota, we are very much at the forefront of trying to have the best type of response. I think it's a long story, but I think it's worth telling. But I think Ellen Johnson probably could start the story as it relates to what's happening in Ramsey County. It's a complicated issue because, but thankfully, because of people like Ellen and all people on this call and MnCASA, we've come up with some legislation to address some of these issues. But Ellen, I know that you can talk about the story involving a refrigerator and just all of the things that we've been working on to try to make sure that we are preserving evidence and doing right by victims.
Thank you. And yes, again, thank you for the refrigerator. There across the state, across, I'm sure all states, it's been a challenge to figure out how to give victims options for reporting after they have had a sexual assault exam, because so many of them cannot make that decision while they're getting a sexual assault exam. So from a storage perspective, there's only so much that a hospital can do to store evidence. And so through the strong work of MnCASA, the statute was enacted late last year. And there is now a statute that says that victim sexual assault evidence will be stored for 30 months. And this allows the patient that amount of time to figure out if they do want to report. But prior to that, John was very dismayed that when the refrigerators got full, and as long as the evidence was stored for at least 90 days, then sexual assault programs needed to discard evidence because there was no place to put it. So what John did was he bought me this huge 3-door refrigerator that I had a bit of a challenge figuring out where to store it, but I have evidence from quite a few years, and I am now storing evidence for 30 months that was collected prior to the statute. So that evidence has been preserved. So,
well,
and thankfully we're at the stage of like talking about storage. You know, there's other communities across America where they go down in the basement and then they find this, locker full of, rape kits that have, tested rape kits that they've done nothing with, right?
Right.
So we're much beyond that. So we're talking about issues relative to storage and trying to understand restricted and unrestricted kits and trying to tell a story that, a lot of victims, they might, after a year, decide to actually make a report. And so holding on to that evidence is really critical. Another person, of course, MnCASA has been at the forefront at the legislative advocacy. But I don't mean to put you on the spot, Jessica, but I think you've been a real superstar in, preserving evidence and all of that. And so, actually through Jessica's effort, she saved a rape kit from being destroyed because of her commitment and diligence. And we were able to actually, because the victim came back and said, I want to change my mind about reporting and going forward. Right. And thanks to Jessica, who saved that rape kit from being destroyed, we were actually able to charge that case. And I think we ended up getting a conviction of third degree criminal sexual conduct, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow, that is very impressive. Thank you so much. Why am I not surprised that we've been leading in that and that we are talking storage and not just untesting? Because I'm hearing these horror stories throughout the country of the untested rape kits, but I'm just so grateful that we are keeping this evidence because we know that that's really important. And Mr. Chair, I have another question, if I could. We talked about rape being a public health issue, and of course it is. And so, and how we need to work on prevention. And so I'm so appreciative of all the work you all are doing. How are we involving our schools, you know, and how we're talking to our girls and our boys about this in the prevention area? So just curious, looking ahead, and I know we all think that's important, but is there any work we're doing on the prevention and early intervention method on all of this? And I know it's ongoing work.
Does public health want to start with that, since that's the public health swim lane, and I could talk a little bit about what we're trying to do too.
Yeah, so the prevention, well, that's one of the new positions that we got in end of 2018 into 19. So it's still a newer program, but those are definitely some things that we are looking at too. But what we are also focusing more on trying to build more primary prevention that will affect more policy and systems as well too, to create a bigger impact. So going into the schools and all that stuff has been helpful. And also we want to have a greater impact. So that would also mean looking at systems and structures and making sure that, you know, if we are engaging with schools and stuff, that we are putting the onus on the adults to prevent the sexual violence and not teaching kids like you have to prevent your own sexual violence. And so there are different things that we're doing. We do have a primary prevention committee that had started. Ala Hassan is our prevention coordinator within SOS. The hard part with what we do is that all of our advocates do direct services, and then the programming piece is just a part of what we do when we get the time to do it, because the direct services do end up taking priority for a lot of things.
And I would just add that I think COVID-19 the pandemic has kind of hurt our ability to do some of the outreach to schools and universities. You know, before the pandemic, we had a very regular presence with SOS, reaching out to, for example, college campuses, and, you know, being a part of perhaps their Title IX training for administrators, right? And we would always be talking about prevention, et cetera, and also too in our St. Paul schools as well. But we haven't, you know, my agency has for sure not done any of that in the past year.
Thank you. Thank you for it being on the radar. I know it's ongoing work that we all are concerned about. So thanks. Thanks for that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Victoria?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will have got a couple of questions, but I just want to first of all thank Trista for starting out and telling her story, because I think most of us in the public spotlight know that it's not unusual to be in many ways re-victimized because you tell your story, you're putting yourself out there, and I just want to say thank you. And hopefully there won't be any nasty emails or anything that are going to come in. But anyhow, a lot of people don't realize that is often what happens. I guess I've been on the county board long enough to know the history of SOS and the fact that there was a point very early on where it was recommended to cut the funding to it. And our county board, now many are not on the county board anymore, but said, no, we're not going to do that. This is important. And what it did, which actually turned out to be a positive thing, was that it raised the awareness of the services that were being provided and how important it was. And in fact, we needed to not cut services, but we needed to expand them, and we needed to bring in more partners. And when I look at the list here with the partners, the collaboration and the members and other partners, I am so impressed with how far we have come, because I think that was one of the problems. People didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to highlight that we really need to do something about this. And that means you have to accept the reality of what's happening. And it's not an easy thing to do. the collaboration here is, I'm sure, the main reason we've been able to have such success and are continuing to go forward. Because yeah, we're not there yet, but we've got a good platform in place to be able to address it. I have two quick questions, and I'll give you both to you because I actually have to leave here pretty soon as well. One is, I'm looking at the main folks, Roseville Police Department, St. Paul Police Department, SOS Services, and Region SANE program, and then the other partners. Now, I know that the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office, through the, I would assume that it's the patrol function or the contract cities that get the same services that the local police departments do. So I'm looking at the other partners, and what I'm wondering is, quite frankly, are there any on here, are there any suburbs that aren't covered? Either through the patrol contracts or through their own police department. I'm assuming they're all covered, but I hate to assume anything. And then finally, the second question is on a different track, and that is, I'm sure many of us read the story about the rape conviction that was overturned because the woman had not been forced to drink, and that there's legislation that is being proposed right now to close that particular loophole. And in fact, Justice Thiessen said, you know, that's the way it's written. And so trying to figure out how do you close that loop? If we have not already taken a position, because I just read this yesterday, if we have not already taken a position to close that loophole and the legislation that's being proposed, we need to do so. So one is, are all the suburbs, is all of Ramsey County covered as far as the services from law enforcement side of things? And then what are we doing as far as the legislation and that loophole that was pointed out?
Jessica, I'll let you talk about the relationships with suburban agencies, but I can assure you that we are providing all these services in the contract cities, and we'll do anything we can to support those suburban agencies as well. This is a countywide initiative for us. Obviously, we have Roseville represented here, but I know that other suburban agencies are on the call as well. You just can't see them.
Yep, everybody is covered. If there's not one that's covered, the Sheriff's Department is covering it, including the stuff that's coming out of the jail.
And Mr. Chair and Commissioner Reinhardt, I think we're so lucky to actually have Artika Roller from Mencasa available, but this is an issue that has been around for a long time on the whole issue of how we define mental incapacitation. And it was something that I feel in some ways this office has kind of gotten vindicated because we got a lot of criticism of not being able to bring forward charges in certain situations involving when a survivor victim would present, maybe they had blacked out or something like that, right? And so this Supreme Court case in many ways underscored what we believe the law to have been, which is actually just, there was a Court of Appeals decision that said this. But we oftentimes prosecutors got criticized for not bringing forward these cases, but the fact is that we couldn't. And I'm so glad that finally this has now been litigated by the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court took the time in their opinion to actually call out the legislature and say, you need to do something about this. And luckily for us, we have a great organization in the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault who is leading on reforming all of our criminal sexual conduct laws as it relates to, especially around consent. And so they've got a big bill that addresses that, but obviously there's very much focus on this piece. And Artika, I'll just throw it over to you about just kind of what our prospects are and where we might stand.
Sure. There is a Senate hearing tomorrow afternoon. I think it will be around 5 o'clock that will specifically address this issue. As John stated, it's been something that we've been working on for quite a few years. And with the Supreme Court ruling last week, it has brought the attention that we need to actually get it fixed. We believe that that fix will happen this year. So it is in Senator Limmer's hand right now, and we'll have a hearing tomorrow, and we're pretty confident that at least that language will be changed, a direct cleanup to the language in the bill, and our statutes will be changed. We're not confident.
Well, and hopefully it has bipartisan support.
Yes, it does. It does have bipartisan support. So we're not confident that the whole bill will pass. That includes multiple statute cleanup, but we are confident that that specific one will pass this year.
Well, if there's anything that we need to do from a legislative standpoint with our intergovernmental relations, I'm sure that John and others are on top of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just a little bit of information on that conversation on the bill. After Judge Thiessen came out with his statement and the ruling, and Representative Mueller and O'Neill, bipartisan, there's a House rule, only 35 legislators can sign on to the bill. They actually had to introduce a second bill because they reached the limit of sign-ons, and they had a lot more legislators wanting to sign on. So I think, you know, we're going to see that piece of it. There's a lot of other legislation that needs to pass, though. You know, a couple of observations here and comments, and the first one is just to thank each and every one of the presenters today, and being a part of this team. I think back to 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, and this would have looked a lot different. It really would have looked a lot different on who was engaged, who was being a part of these conversations, who was willing to step up and challenge their own organizations to do better. And so I just so appreciative of everybody in the work that they're doing here. Another piece here, and I think every presenter acknowledged it, you know, acknowledging that we're doing so much better. Our numbers are looking so much better, but we've got so much more work to do. And that's part of the nature of taking on something that has been ignored for so long, is the more you peel it back, the more you realize there's work to do. It's the numbers are even greater. I give John so much credit for the 2 years that he had Karn and folks really taking a hard look at what his office and the community was doing along this, because it is, you open yourself up, and you know, the farther and deeper we go into this, the more we see we got so much more work to do. And so I appreciate, again, each and every one of the presenters and organizations here really truly having an understanding that we've got a lot of work to do. We got to take a moment, we got to celebrate, we've got to recognize and thank people, but we've got to broaden and continue to grow this. And that's the other piece of this, that it's been said maybe in, you know, pieces here, but the fact is, this work doesn't get to where we're at today with the information we're hearing without people willing to really challenge and make a culture change within their organizations. Because this wasn't necessarily, you know, the results, the poor results we had in the past, whether it's charging or arrests or convictions, wasn't necessarily because of policy or because of even budget issues. It was because of a culture that really worked against victims having their day and the opportunity for them to see people held accountable. And that culture not only prevented that, but it was also designed with intent to keep it down, right? To keep our community from really understanding how pervasive sexual violence and harm is in our community and how much it damages not individuals. Someone talked about, I think, Bahua, you talked about the collateral damage here to families and loved ones and the impact it has on our greater community. So I just want to make sure that we're taking that moment to celebrate, challenge. Walking away from here, we should all feel invigorated and challenging ourselves to do better, not only on results, but on changing the culture within our community so that we start getting to the prevention piece. Again, I get it, every day you get a call from a victim and you got to be there and you got to drop the prevention work, but there's so much going on out there, and there are organizations that are really putting a lot into the prevention piece, especially when it comes to the male role in the prevention, right? And because again, this is a preventable crime. It's a preventable occurrence that happens in our community. And I, we go to rape, this kind of rape, right? The trigger word really quickly, but the fact is, sexual violence and harm comes to us in so many ways. And for us to be able to address it, we need to make sure we're looking at it and we're being honest about what's occurring in our community. So I thank each and every one of you for willing to do that. John, your leadership and pulling people together, but also trusting people to go with this and to, really take it. It's just heartwarming. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Well said. And I'll leave that as the last word from the board, and I'll give John the last few minutes here.
Well, I'm just kind of speechless, I guess. After just all of this and listening to Jim, I just very much, again, I want to reiterate this. I really appreciate the support of the Board of Commissioners. I feel like every step of the way with respect to this work, you've been there. I mean, you could have easily said back in 2018, okay, great, you identified some more resources, but we'll take it up at the next budget cycle. And, you need to prepare a memo and, all of that. But you didn't say that. You said, we want to, what do you need to get going on this work? And so I appreciate that support, the support from the deputy county managers. And again, I know that I'm repeating myself, but I'm just so proud of the collaboration and the work that's happening. Nothing good ever happens unless good intentioned people come together and want to make a difference. And we're doing it because our public wants us to. We serve the public. And I know that it's been heartwarming too, to see some cracks in that culture, Commissioner McDonough, that you talked about, where I see that there's more ability and freedom and liberation for those who have been harmed by others because of sexual violence to be able to share their stories. And for those of us who've had the privilege of never having been harmed in that particular way, to connect to that harm and want to do something different and to create a better culture and to create a better system of response, not just within government, but also I think within our friendships and our families. I think we're evolving as a community, but we still have a long ways to go. But it's just really a great privilege. And I know it's a great privilege for all of the dedicated public servants that work in government here that are part of this call to be a part of this journey and to have something to be a part of making a difference. So thank you.
Well, thank you to everybody. Believe me, this board is very proud of this collaboration and the great work. Thank you so much again, and I guess we're adjourned. Have a good one.
Well done.
Well done, everyone. Thank you so much.